The sun was barely up when Jake Martinez loaded his old pickup truck and headed down the dusty road toward Amarillo. The radio crackled with weather reports and cattle prices while he sipped coffee from a thermos that had seen better days. At 53, Jake had been working ranches his whole life, and today was auction day at the Tri-State Livestock Center. He needed a good workhorse, something reliable that could help him move his small herd of cattle around his property outside. Lubbock Jake wasn't a wealthy man. His ranch was modest, just enough land to run about 60 head of cattle and make a decent living. His wife, Maria, had passed away 3 years ago, and since then, the place felt bigger and quieter than it used to. She had been the one who really understood horses. Jake could ride well enough and knew how to handle cattle, but Maria could look at a horse and tell you everything about its character just by watching it move. The auction yard was already busy when Jake pulled into the gravel parking lot. Trucks and trailers filled every available space, and the air buzzed with the sound of livestock and people talking business. Cowboys in worn jeans and dusty boots walked between the pens, checking out the animals that would go up for sale. Jake recognized some faces from previous auctions, but mostly kept to himself. He had about $800 in his pocket, money he'd saved specifically for buying a horse. Walking through the holding pens, Jake looked at each animal carefully. There were some beautiful quarter horses that caught his eye, their coats shining in the morning sun. A few young Mustangs pranced around their pens, full of energy and spirit. But the prices for good horses had gone up over the years, and Jake knew he'd have to be smart about his purchase. Then he saw her in pen number 17 stood an old bay mare that looked like she'd seen much better days. Her brown coat was dull and dusty, and you could see her ribs showing through her skin. She stood with her head hanging low, not paying attention to the people walking by. Her left back leg seemed to bother her because she kept shifting her weight. Most folks just glanced at her and kept walking, shaking their heads. Jake stopped and watched her for a while. Something about the way she carried herself made him curious. Even though she was clearly old and tired, there was something dignified about her posture. Her eyes, when she occasionally lifted her head, were clear and intelligent. She wasn't mean or aggressive like some horses got when they were herding. She was just quiet, like she was waiting for something. A younger cowboy standing nearby noticed. Jake, looking at the mare, and chuckled. "Wouldn't waste your time on that one, friend? She's probably got one foot in the grave already. Can't imagine she'd be much use for anything." Jake nodded politely but didn't move away from the pen. He'd learned over the years that appearances could be deceiving. Some of the best horses he'd ever worked with hadn't looked like much at first glance. This old mare reminded him of a horse his grandfather used to have, a gentle giant that had worked the family ranch for over 20 years. The auction started at 10 o'clock sharp. Jake found a seat in the bleachers and watched as animal after animal was led into the ring. The auctioneer's voice echoed through the building as bids flew back and forth. A nice young gelding went for $1,200, well out of Jake's price range. A pair of mares sold together for $1,500. Jake started to worry that he might go home empty-handed when they brought in the old bay mare. The atmosphere in the room changed. People stopped paying close attention. Some got up to get coffee or use the restroom. The mare stood quietly in the center of the ring, looking around with those same intelligent eyes Jake had noticed earlier. "Now, folks, here we have lot number 17, the auctioneer announced, his voice less enthusiastic than it had been for the previous horses. The bay mare, approximately 20-something years old. She's been well fed and cared for, just looking for a quiet place to spend her retirement. Years. The bidding started at $25. Only one hand went up. The auctioneer tried to build some excitement, but you could tell his heart wasn't in it. "Come on now, $25 for a gentle mare. She'd make a good companion horse." For someone, the bid went to $30, then $40. Jake watched as only 2 people seemed interested, and neither of them looked particularly enthusiastic. At $50, one of the bidders dropped out, leaving just one man who looked like he might be buying horses for a meat processor. Something in Jake's chest tightened. The thought of this old mare ending up in such a place didn't sit right with him. He thought about Maria and how she used to rescue stray cats and dogs, always saying that every animal deserved kindness in their final years. Without really thinking about it, Jake raised his hand. $60, the auctioneer called out, sounding surprised to see a new bidder. The other man looked over at Jake, sizing him up, then raised his hand again. $70. Jake's heart was beating faster now. $70 was money he could afford to lose, but it would mean starting over with his horse shopping. Still, looking at the old Mary standing so patiently in the ring, he couldn't bring himself to let her go to an uncertain fate. 75. Jake called out, raising his hand again. The other bidder hesitated, looked at the Murray again, then shook his head and walked away. Jake had won the auction, but as the reality of what he'd just done sank in, he wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake. After the auction, Jake walked over to pen 17 with a lead rope and halter. The old Mare watched him approach but didn't move away. When he opened the gate and stepped inside, she actually took a small step toward him, as if she knew he was there to help her. "Well, old girl," Jake said softly, running his hand along her neck, "looks like you're coming home with me. I hope I can give you whatever it is you need." The Mare's coat was rougher than it looked from a distance, and she was definitely underweight, but her eyes were bright and alert. When Jake slipped the halter over her head, she accepted it without any fuss, like she'd done this 1,000 times before. Loading her into his trailer took some patience. She was stiff and moved slowly, but she wasn't difficult or scared. Jake got the feeling that she'd traveled in trailers before and knew the routine. As he secured the trailer gate and prepared for the drive home, he realized he didn't even have a name for his new horse. "I'll think of something," he told her through the trailer slats. "Something that fits." The drive back to his ranch gave Jake time to think about what he'd gotten himself into. He'd gone to the auction looking for a workhorse and had instead bought what amounted to a very expensive pasture pet. But as he pulled into his driveway and saw his empty corrals and pastures, he felt like maybe this was exactly what the place needed. Some life, some purpose beyond just him rattling around. By himself, the old Mare had found her way to him for a reason, even if he didn't understand what that reason was yet. The trailer bumped and swayed as Jake drove the winding back roads toward his ranch. Every few minutes he glanced in his side mirror to check on his new horse. Through the trailer slats, he could see her standing quietly, bracing herself against the movement but not panicking like some horses might. She seemed calm, almost resigned to whatever was happening to her. Jake's ranch sat on 200 acres of rolling Texas grassland, about 15 miles outside Lubbock. It wasn't much to look at from the road, just a simple wooden gate, a gravel driveway, and a weathered mailbox with Martinez Ranch painted in fading letters. But beyond the gate, the land opened up into something special. Wide pastures stretched toward the horizon, dotted with mesquite trees and crossed by a small creek that ran year-round. The ranch buildings were modest, but well-maintained. A small white farmhouse sat near a cluster of outbuildings that included a red barn, several corrals, and a machine shed where Jake kept his tractors and equipment. Maria had planted flower gardens around the house years ago, and though Jake tried his best to keep them up, they weren't quite as colorful as they used to be. As Jake pulled up near the barn, his neighbor Betty walked over from her property next door. Betty was in her 70s, a retired veterinarian who'd spent 40 years taking care of livestock all over West Texas. She was a small woman with silver hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, but she had hands that could calm the most nervous animal and eyes that missed nothing when it came to livestock. "What you got there, Jake?" Betty called out as he climbed down from his truck. "Please tell me you didn't buy some crazy bronc that's gonna tear up your corrals." Jake chuckled and shook his head. "Nothing exciting, I'm afraid. Just an old Mare that needed a home." He walked to the back of the trailer and started working on the latch. "Fair warning, though, she's seen better days." Betty raised an eyebrow, but didn't say anything as Jake lowered the trailer ramp. The old Mare stood at the front of the trailer, looking out at her new surroundings with curiosity rather than fear. Jake climbed into the trailer and gently encouraged her to back out. The Mare took her time, testing each step carefully before putting her full weight down. Her left hind leg was definitely bothering her, and she moved with the careful deliberation of an animal that had learned to manage chronic pain. But she wasn't limping badly, just favoring that leg slightly. When she finally stepped onto solid ground, Betty let out a low whistle. "Jake Martinez, what in the world were you thinking? This poor old gal looks like she's been through a war." But even as Betty spoke, she was already moving closer to the horse, her trained eye taking in every detail. The Murray stood quietly as Betty ran gentle hands over her legs, checked her teeth, and listened to her breathing. Despite her criticism, Jake could see the compassion in Betty's face as she examined the animal. "How much did you pay for her?" Betty asked, still running her hands along the Mare's neck and shoulders. $75, Jake admitted, feeling a little foolish now that he was saying it out loud. Betty looked up at him with surprise. 75? Jake, horses like this usually go for meat prices. You could have gotten her for 25 if you'd waited. Jake felt his face flush with embarrassment, but he also felt a flicker of anger. Maybe so, but I wasn't about to let some meat buyer take her just to save a few dollars. Betty's expression softened immediately. "Oh, honey, I didn't mean it that way. You did a good thing here. I'm just trying to figure out what you're planning to do with her." She continued her examination, gently lifting each of the Mare's hooves to check them. "She's old, probably 25 or so. Got some arthritis in that back leg, needs to put on at least 100 pounds, and her hooves haven't been trimmed in months." Jake watched Betty work, remembering how Maria used to do the same thing with every stray animal that found its way to their ranch. "So what are you saying? That I should have left her at the auction?" "No, absolutely not," Betty said firmly. "I'm saying you've got yourself a project here. This old girl is going to need a lot of care if you want to give her a comfortable retirement." She straightened up and looked Jake in the eye. "The question is, are you prepared for that?" Jake looked at the Mare, who was now sniffing at the ground near the barn. Despite her poor condition, there was something peaceful about her presence. She wasn't nervous or aggressive. She wasn't trying to escape or cause trouble. She was just quietly taking in her new home. "I guess we'll figure it out as we go," Jake said. "What should I call her?" Betty smiled for the first time since seeing the horse. "Well, she's got that pretty bay coloring, and look at those white markings on her face. Looks like a star and a little stripe. How about Belle? Simple, classic, fits a lady of her age." "Belle," Jake repeated, testing the name. The Mare's ears flicked toward him when he said it, almost like she approved. "Belle it is." Betty helped Jake get Belle settled in one of the smaller corrals near the barn. They filled a water trough and put out some good quality hay, though. Betty warned Jake not to let Belle eat too much too fast after being underfed for so long. "Start her slow," Betty advised. "Small amounts of feed several times a day until she gets her weight back up. And you'll want to call the farrier to get those hooves trimmed. I can give you some supplements that'll help with that arthritis, too." As they stood watching Belle explore her new corral, Jake felt a mix of emotions he couldn't quite name. Worry about whether he'd bitten off more than he could chew. Sadness about Belle's condition and whatever hard life had brought her to this point. But also something else, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in a long time. "You know," Betty said quietly, "Maria would have done exactly the same thing." Jake nodded, his throat tight. Maria had always been the one to bring home strays and lost causes. Dogs with 3 legs, cats missing eyes, once even a baby deer whose mother had been hit by a car. She'd nurse them back to health with a patience Jake had always admired but never quite understood. That evening, after Betty had gone home and Jake had finished his other chores, he found himself sitting on the fence rail of Belle's corral. The old Mare was lying down in the soft dirt, something horses only do when they feel safe. Her breathing was steady and peaceful. "I don't know what your story is, girl," Jake said softly, "but whatever brought you here, I promise you'll have a good home for whatever time you've got left." Belle opened one eye and looked at him, then closed it again with what looked almost like a sigh of contentment. For the first time since Maria's death, Jake felt like the ranch wasn't quite so lonely. He had someone to take care of again. Someone who needed him. As the sun set over the Texas prairie, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Jake made mental plans for Belle's care. Better feed, medicine for her arthritis, maybe even a companion animal if she seemed lonely. He didn't know it yet, but he'd just made the best $75 investment of his life. 3 weeks had passed since Belle arrived at the ranch, and Jake could hardly believe the change in her. The skinny, tired horse from the auction was filling out nicely. Her ribs no longer showed through her coat, and there was a brightness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Betty's arthritis medicine seemed to be helping too. Belle moved with less stiffness. Though she still favored that left hind leg on cold mornings, Jake had settled into a routine with Belle that started before sunrise each day. He'd walk out to her corral with a cup of coffee in hand and a small bucket of grain. Belle would always be waiting at the gate, nickering softly when she saw him coming. It was a gentle sound, not demanding or impatient, just a quiet greeting. That said, she was happy to see him. What surprised Jake most was how quickly Belle had adapted to ranch life. Most horses, especially older ones, took months to settle into new routines. But Belle seemed to understand everything immediately. When Jake opened her gate to let her into the larger pasture, she never tried to run off or cause trouble. She just walked calmly to wherever she wanted to graze, always keeping Jake in sight. The first strange thing Jake noticed happened on a Tuesday morning while he was fixing a section of fence in the north pasture. He'd been working alone, stretching new wire between posts, when storm clouds started building on the horizon. Texas weather could change fast, and Jake knew he should probably head back to the barn soon, but before he could gather his tools, Belle appeared at his side. She hadn't been anywhere near him when he started working. She'd been grazing clear on the other side of the pasture. Yet here she was, standing close enough to touch, looking toward the approaching storm with obvious concern. "What's wrong, girl?" Jake asked, scratching behind her ears. Belle nudged his shoulder gently, then took a few steps toward the barn and looked back at him expectantly. Within minutes, the sky opened up with a downpour that soaked everything in sight. Jake and Belle ran for the barn together, and as they stood in the doorway watching the rain, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that Belle had known the storm was coming long before he did. The next incident happened a few days later while Jake was moving his cattle from one pasture to another. It was a job that usually required a lot of running around on foot, opening gates, and encouraging stubborn cows to go where they needed to go. Jake had planned to do it alone, like always, but Belle had other ideas. As soon as Jake started herding the cattle toward the gate, Belle positioned herself on the opposite side of the herd. Without any direction from Jake, she began moving back and forth, keeping the cows grouped together and gently pushing them in the right direction. She seemed to know exactly where Jake wanted the cattle to go, and she worked with a skill that took most ranch horses years to develop. Jake watched in amazement as Belle anticipated every move the cattle might make. When one ornery bull tried to break away from the group, Belle was there to block his path. When a few young calves got distracted and started wandering off, Belle quietly circled around to guide them back to their mothers. She worked without fuss or excitement, just steady, intelligent effort that made the whole job go 3 times faster than usual. "Where did you learn to do that?" Jake asked her afterward, running his hand along her neck. Belle just looked at him with those calm, knowing eyes, as if working cattle was the most natural thing in the world. The incidents kept happening. Belle seemed to have an uncanny ability to know when Jake needed help, even when he didn't realize it himself. One morning, Jake was replacing a broken board on the barn wall when Belle appeared with a hammer in her mouth. A hammer Jake had left on his workbench inside the barn. He hadn't asked her to bring it, hadn't even realized he'd forgotten it until she dropped it at his feet. Another time, Jake was checking on a sick calf in the far pasture when Belle showed up carrying his medical kit by the handle. The kit had been sitting in his truck, and somehow Belle had managed to open the truck door and retrieve it. Jake stood there scratching his head, trying to figure out how a horse could possibly know that he needed those supplies. The most remarkable incident happened on a Friday evening when Jake was working late in the barn, organizing feed supplies. He'd been moving heavy bags of grain from his truck to the storage room, making trip after trip in the fading daylight. His back was aching, and he was tired from a long week of ranch work. Belle had been turned out in the pasture for the night. But when Jake looked up from his work, there she was in the barn aisle. The gate to her pasture was still closed and latched, but somehow she'd gotten out. That wasn't the strange part, though. Horses were notorious escape artists when they wanted to be. The strange part was what Belle did next. She walked over to Jake's truck, grabbed one of the grain bags in her teeth, and carefully carried it to the storage room. Then she went back for another one. Jake watched in stunned silence as Belle made trip after trip, moving the heavy bags with surprising ease and placing them exactly where they needed to go. "Belle, what in the world?" Jake said, but he didn't try to stop her. She seemed to know exactly what she was doing, and honestly, she was doing it better than he could have managed alone when all the grain was moved. Belle walked over to Jake and gently nudged his shoulder, then headed back toward her pasture. Jake followed her, trying to figure out how she'd gotten out in the first place. The gate was still securely latched, the fence was intact, and there was no obvious way for a horse to escape. That night, Jake called Betty and told her about Belle's strange behaviors. Betty listened without interrupting, but Jake could hear the skepticism in her voice when she finally responded. "Jake, honey, you've been spending a lot of time alone out there. Sometimes when we're lonely, we start seeing things that aren't really there. Belle's a smart horse, I'll give you that, but what you're describing sounds ... Sounds crazy, I know," Jake interrupted. "But Betty, I'm telling you, this horse is different. She does things that normal horses don't do. She knows things she shouldn't know." Betty was quiet for a moment. "Well," she said finally, "horses are amazing animals. They can sense things we can't, and they're much smarter than most people give them credit for. Maybe Belle just has good instincts." After Jake hung up the phone, he walked out to Belle's pasture. She was standing near the fence, and when she saw him coming, she walked over and rested her head against his chest. Jake stroked her neck and thought about everything that had happened over the past few weeks. Maybe Betty was right. Maybe he was just lonely and reading too much into normal horse behavior. But deep down, Jake knew there was something special about Belle, something that went beyond good instincts or smart breeding. She had a way of understanding not just what Jake needed, but when he needed it. She worked with a precision and intelligence that spoke of serious training, the kind of training that took years to develop. Standing there in the moonlight with Belle's warm breath against his shirt, Jake found himself wondering about her past. Who had owned her before? Where had she learned to work cattle with such skill? And how had a horse with such obvious training and intelligence ended up at a livestock auction, unwanted and forgotten? "You've got secrets, don't you, girl?" Jake whispered into Belle's ear. "Someday I'm going to figure out what your story really is." Winter had arrived early in West Texas, bringing with it cold mornings and a thick growth of winter coat on Belle. Jake had been taking extra care of her during the colder weather, making sure she had plenty of hay and checking on her more frequently. The arthritis in her back legs seemed to bother her more when the temperature dropped, so Jake had started bringing her into the barn on the coldest nights. It was during one of these barn stays that Jake made the discovery that would change everything. He thought he knew about Belle. The morning had started like any other. Jake arrived at the barn with Belle's breakfast and found her standing quietly in her stall, steam rising from her nostrils in the cold air. She nickered softly when she saw him, the same gentle greeting she gave him every morning. But when Jake bent down to check her hooves for stones or debris, something caught his eye that he'd never noticed before. Belle's thick winter coat had grown in unevenly in one spot on her left shoulder. Where most horses develop a smooth, thick covering of hair, Belle had a patch where the hair grew in different directions, creating what looked like a pattern. Jake ran his hand over the area, feeling the texture change beneath his fingers. "Hold still, girl," Jake murmured, grabbing a soft brush from his grooming kit. "Let me get a better look at this." As Jake gently brushed away the loose hair and dirt, the pattern became clearer. It wasn't just random hair growth. It was a brand mark, hidden beneath years of hair growth and weather exposure. The mark was old and faded, but as Jake worked carefully to clean the area, he could make out distinct shapes. The brand showed a 5-pointed star with the letter R next to it. The lines were clean and professional, not the rough work of a local ranch brand. This looked like something that had been designed and registered, the kind of brand that meant something specific to someone who knew what to look for. Jake's heart started beating faster. In all his years around horses, he'd seen thousands of brands. Most ranches in Texas use simple designs, initials, numbers, or basic shapes that were easy to apply and recognize. But this brand was different. It had a polished, almost commercial look to it. "Star R," Jake said out loud, running, his finger along the faded lines. What kind of outfit uses a brand like that? Belle stood patiently while Jake examined the mark from every angle. The brand was definitely real, burned into her skin years ago, when she was much younger. But it had been applied so long ago that only careful inspection revealed it. No wonder no one at the auction had noticed it. Most people wouldn't have. Looked closely enough to find it under all that hair and dirt that Jake spent the rest of the morning thinking about the brand while he did his regular chores. He'd lived in Texas his whole life and knew most of the major ranches in the area, but he'd never seen a Star R brand before. It wasn't local, that much was certain. But where had it come from, and what did it tell him about Belle's past? Afternoon, Jake drove into town to use the internet at the public library. His ranch didn't have reliable internet service, and his old flip phone certainly couldn't help him research anything. The librarian, a friendly woman named Ruth who'd known Jake since he was a boy, helped him get set up at one of the computers. "What are you looking up today, Jake?" Ruth asked as she logged him into the system. "Trying to find information about a horse brand," Jake explained. "Star R, a star with the letter R next to it." Ruth raised an eyebrow. "That's oddly specific. Find something interesting?" Jake nodded but didn't elaborate. He wasn't ready to share Belle's story with anyone until he understood it better himself. The first few searches didn't turn up much. Jake tried Star R Ranch, Star R Brand, and various combinations, but most of the results were for current ranches or livestock operations that didn't match what he was looking for. The brands he found were either too simple or too different from what he'd seen on Belle. Then Jake tried a different approach. Instead of searching for active ranches, he started looking up historical information about horse breeding and training operations. He figured that a brand as distinctive as the Star R might have belonged to someone in the horse business rather than just cattle ranching. That's when he found it. The search result was buried on the third page of results, in an old newspaper article from 1989. The headline read, "Star Ranch provides horses for major motion picture." Jake clicked on the link with trembling fingers. The article was from a small Arizona newspaper, and it described how a place called Star Ranch had supplied trained horses for a Western movie being filmed outside Phoenix. The ranch specialized in training horses for the entertainment industry, providing animals for movies, television shows, and live performances. Jake's eyes widened as he read further. The article mentioned that Star Ranch horses were known throughout Hollywood for their intelligence, training, and ability to perform complex stunts safely. The ranch had been in business for over 20 years and had worked on dozens of major productions, and there, in a grainy black and white photo accompanying the article, was the Star R brand clearly visible on the shoulder of a horse being led. Onto a movie set, Jake sat back in his chair, his mind racing. Belle wasn't just any old ranch horse. She was a trained movie horse, a professional performer who had worked in the entertainment industry. That explained her unusual intelligence, her ability to anticipate what people needed, and her remarkable skill with cattle work. But the article was from 1989, over 30 years ago. Jake quickly searched for more recent information about Star Ranch, but what he found made his heart sink. According to several sources, Star Ranch had closed down in the early 2000s when the movie industry started using more computer-generated effects instead of real animals. Jake found a few more articles about the ranch's closure. The owner, a man named Robert Clearwater, had sold off most of his horses when the business could no longer support itself. Some had gone to other entertainment operations, others to private owners who wanted well-trained riding horses. But many of the older horses had simply disappeared into the general population, their Hollywood past forgotten. One article mentioned that Robert Clearwater had moved to a retirement community in Scottsdale, Arizona, after selling the ranch. Jake made a note of this information, wondering if the old man might still be alive and willing to talk about his horses. Jake spent another hour researching, finding old movie credits that mentioned Star Ranch, photographs of their horses performing stunts, and even a few video clips from Western movies where he thought he might have spotted horses with the distinctive Star brand. By the time Jake left the library, his head was spinning with questions. How had Belle ended up at a livestock auction in Texas? How long had she been away from her original home? And most importantly, what was her real name and what movies had she appeared in? That evening, Jake sat in Belle's stall while she ate her dinner. He studied her with new eyes, trying to imagine her as a young horse working on movie sets, performing stunts and working with professional trainers and actors. "Is that who you are, girl?" Jake asked softly. "Are you some kind of movie star?" Belle lifted her head from her feed bucket and looked at him with those intelligent eyes. For a moment, Jake could have sworn he saw recognition there, as if she understood exactly what he was talking about. Jake pulled out his phone and scrolled through the contact information he'd written down at the library. Tomorrow he was going to call Arizona and see if he could track down Robert Clearwater. If Belle really was one of his horses, Jake needed to know her story. After everything they'd been through together, she deserved to have her past remembered and honored. Jake barely slept that night. His mind kept racing with questions about Belle and her past. Every time he closed his eyes, he pictured her as a young horse on a movie set, working with actors and stunt riders, performing the kinds of scenes he'd watched in Western movies his whole life. By 5 a.m, he gave up on sleep and headed out to the barn with his coffee. Belle was already awake, standing near her stall door as if she'd been waiting for him. In the dim light of the barn, Jake studied her face more carefully than ever before. Now that he knew what to look for, he could see hints of the training she'd received. The way she held her head, the alertness in her eyes, even the way she moved spoke of professional conditioning. "Morning, movie star," Jake said softly, scratching behind her ears. Belle's ears pricked forward at the sound of his voice, and she nuzzled his shoulder gently. Jake had written down Robert Clearwater's information on a piece of paper, along with the phone number for the retirement community in Scottsdale. Arizona was 2 hours behind Texas time, so he'd have to wait until later in the morning to make the call. The waiting was killing him. After finishing his morning chores, Jake drove back into town. He wanted to use the library's internet again to do more research before making the phone call. Ruth was there when the library opened, and she greeted Jake with a curious smile. "Back again so soon? You must have found something interesting yesterday." "You could say that," Jake replied, settling down at the same computer he'd used today. Before this time, Jake searched more specifically for information about Star Ranch horses and their movie careers. He found several websites dedicated to Hollywood horse history, and one of them had a section about Star Ranch that made his heart race. The website showed dozens of photographs from various Western movies and TV shows. Jake scrolled through them, slowly examining each horse carefully. Many of them bore the distinctive Star brand, and several looked remarkably similar to Belle. The horses were shown performing amazing stunts, rearing on command, falling down as if shot, racing through explosions and gunfire. One photograph in particular caught Jake's attention. It showed a young bay mare with white markings on her face, standing next to a famous actor Jake recognized from old Western movies. The caption read, "Hollywood Belle performs a complex stunt sequence for the 1992 film, Desert Thunder." Jake stared at the photograph for a long time. The horse in the picture had the same intelligent eyes, the same distinctive white star and stripe on her face that Belle had. Even allowing for the passage of 30 years, the resemblance was unmistakable. Hollywood Belle, Jake whispered to himself. That's your real name, isn't it, girl? Jake printed out the photograph and several others that showed similar horses. By the time he finished his research, he had a stack of papers that told an incredible story. Star Ranch had been one of the premier horse training facilities in the country, and their horses had appeared in over 50 major films and television shows. At 10 o'clock Arizona time, Jake finally worked up the courage to make the phone call. His hands were shaking slightly as he dialed the number for the Sunset Hills Retirement Community in Scottsdale. "Good morning, Sunset Hills," a cheerful voice answered. "Hello, I'm trying to reach Robert Clearwater. I believe he's a resident there." "Let me check our directory. May I ask who's calling?" "My name is Jake Martinez. I'm calling from Texas about one of his horses." There was a pause, then the woman said, "Just a moment, please. I'll see if Mr. Clearwater is available." Jake waited nervously, listening to hold music and wondering what he would say if the old man actually came to the phone. After what felt like forever, a gravelly voice came on the line. "This is Robert Clearwater. Did I hear right that you're calling about one of my horses?" "Yes, sir." "My name is Jake Martinez, and I live on a ranch outside Lubbock, Texas. I recently bought an old bay mare at a livestock auction, and I found your Star R brand on her shoulder. I think she might be one of yours." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Robert finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "Son, I haven't heard about one of my horses in over 15 years. Most of them would be dead by now. Can you describe this mare to you?" Jake described Belle in detail, her size, her coloring, the white markings on her face, her approximate age, and her unusual intelligence and training. Robert was quiet for a long moment after Jake finished. "What did you say your horse's name was?" "I've been calling her Belle, but I found a photograph online that shows a horse called Hollywood Belle from one of your movies. Desert Thunder from 1992. Jake heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "My God," Robert said softly. "Hollywood Belle. I can't believe she's still alive." "So you remember her? Remember her?" "Son, Belle was one of the most talented horses I ever trained. She could do things that took most horses years to learn, and she picked them up in weeks. She worked on more than a dozen major films and was the safest, most reliable stunt horse in the business." Robert's voice grew stronger as he talked about Belle. "She was born right here at Star Ranch in 1989. Her mother was a quarter horse, and her father was a thoroughbred we brought in specifically for breeding movie horses. Belle had the perfect combination of intelligence, athleticism, and temperament for film work." "What happened to her when you closed the ranch?" Jake asked. Robert sighed heavily. "When the movie business started using computer effects instead of real horses, I had to make some hard decisions. I sold off most of my younger horses to other trainers and kept a few of the older ones for breeding. But Belle was getting on in years, and I found what I thought was a good home for her with a family in New Mexico who wanted a gentle riding horse for their kids." "Do you know what happened after that?" "I lost track of her after the first year. The family moved, and I never heard anything more. I always wondered what became of her." Robert's voice cracked slightly. "To think that she ended up at a livestock auction. Breaks my heart." Jake found himself getting emotional too. "Mr. Clearwater, I want you to know that Belle is in good hands now. She's healthy and happy, and I'm taking good care of her. What's her condition like?" "Is she still sound?" "She's got some arthritis in her back leg, but she gets around fine. She's put on weight since I got her, and she's still incredibly smart. Just last week, she helped me move cattle like she'd been doing it her whole life." Robert chuckled through his tears. "That doesn't surprise me. Belle always was a quick learner. We used her for cattle scenes in several movies, and she took to it like she was born for it." "Mr. Clearwater, would you mind if I asked you more about Belle's career? I'd love to know what movies she was in and what kind of work she did." "Son, I'd be happy to tell you everything I remember. Belle was special, and her story deserves to be told." Robert paused, then added, "In fact, I've got boxes of photographs and even some old video footage from her filming days. If you're interested, I'd be willing to send you copies." Jake's heart leaped. That would be incredible. Belle deserves to have her history remembered. Give me your address, and I'll put together a package for you. It might take me a few days to dig through all my old files, but I'll find everything I can about Hollywood Belle. As Jake gave Robert his mailing address, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Belle's mysterious past was finally coming into focus, and soon he'd know the full story of her remarkable career. More importantly, someone who had loved and trained her was still alive to remember her glory days. Mr. Clearwater, thank you so much for talking with me. This means more than you know. Thank you for calling, Jake, and thank you for giving Belle a loving home. She was always one of my favorites, and knowing she's safe and cared for, well, that's the best news I've had in years. The package from Robert Clearwater arrived on a Thursday morning, delivered by a mail truck that kicked up dust clouds as it rumbled down Jake's gravel driveway. Jake had been watching for it every day since their phone conversation 2 weeks earlier, and when he saw the large manila envelope with Arizona return address, his heart started racing. Jake carried the package straight to Belle's pasture before opening it. She was grazing near the fence, and when she saw him coming with the envelope, she walked over with that curious intelligence he'd grown to love. "This is about you, girl," Jake said, settling down on an old tree stump near the fence. "Let's see what secrets Robert sent us." Inside the envelope were dozens of photographs, some in color and others in black and white. There were also several handwritten pages of notes and what looked like old movie contracts. But what made Jake's breath catch was a DVD labeled Hollywood Belle, Career Highlights, in Robert's careful handwriting. Jake spread the photographs out on his lap, and Belle stretched her neck over the fence to look at them too, almost as if she knew what they were. The pictures showed a young, beautiful Bae Marais in her prime, performing stunts that took Jake's breath away. In one photo, Belle was rearing up on her hind legs with a cowboy actor on her back, both front hooves pawing the air dramatically. Another showed her lying on her side as if she'd been shot, with smoke and dust all around her from some kind of explosion effect. There was even a picture of Belle wearing a fancy saddle and bridle, standing next to a stagecoach for what looked like a period Western film, but the most amazing photograph showed Belle mid-jump, sailing over a wooden fence with her rider crouched low on her back. The caption on the back read, "Belle clears 6-foot fence for chase scene in copper. Canyon Showdown -1994. "Look at you," Jake whispered, holding up the jumping photo so Belle could see it. "You were incredible." Robert's handwritten notes filled in the details of Belle's career. She had worked on 16 major films and 8 television shows between 1991 and 2003. Her specialties included high-speed chase scenes, controlled falls, firework, and complex liberty sequences where she performed without a rider. One note made Jake smile. Belle was always the smartest horse on any set. She learned her cues faster than most of the human actors learned their lines. Directors loved working with her because she never needed more than 3 takes to get a scene right. Another note was more technical. Belle's training included over 200 individual commands and movements. She could respond to hand signals, voice commands, whistle cues, and even musical cues for dance sequences. Her memory was exceptional. She could perform routines months after learning them with no practice. Jake drove into town that afternoon to watch the DVD at Betty's house, since she had a better television and DVD player than his old setup. Betty was fascinated by Jake's discovery and insisted on watching the footage with him. The DVD contained clips from Belle's various movie appearances, edited together with behind-the-scenes footage of her training. Jake and Betty sat in amazed silence as they watched Belle perform stunt after stunt with grace and precision. In one clip, Belle galloped at full speed toward the camera before sliding to a dramatic stop just inches from the lens. In another, she performed a complex routine where she reared, spun in circles, and then lay down and died on command, all while dramatic music played in the background. "My goodness," Betty said, shaking her head. "No wonder she was so good at working your cattle. This horse has had more professional training than most Olympic animals." The most impressive footage showed Belle working without a rider in what Robert's notes called liberty work. She galloped in precise patterns around an arena, changed directions on whistle commands, and even performed a sequence where she appeared to dance to music. How did she know to do all that? Jake asked, pointing at the screen. Years of training, Betty replied. Look how she watches for cues. See how her ears are always focused on someone off camera? She's listening for commands we can't hear. When they got home that evening, Jake went straight to Belle's pasture with a new understanding of who she really was. He'd been thinking of her as a retired ranch horse, but now he realized she was more like a retired athlete, someone who had spent years perfecting her craft at the highest level. Want to show me what you remember? Jake asked, climbing over the fence to stand with Belle in the pasture. Almost without thinking, Jake raised his right hand high above his head. It was a gesture he'd seen in one of the training videos, and he was curious to see if Belle would respond. Belle's reaction was immediate. She backed up several steps, then reared up on her hind legs, striking the air with her front hooves just like in the photographs. She held the position for several seconds before coming back down and looking at Jake. Expectantly, Jake's heart pounded with excitement. Good girl, that was amazing. He tried another gesture from the videos, pointing to the ground with his index finger. Belle immediately lay down and rolled onto her side, staying perfectly still until Jake clapped his hands twice. Then she jumped back to her feet and shook herself off. Over the next hour, Jake experimented with different signals and commands he'd seen in the footage. Belle responded to almost all of them, her muscle memory intact after years of retirement. She could spin in circles, bow her head, back up in straight lines, and even perform a movement where she lifted one front leg and held it up like a handshake. You never forgot, did you? Jake said, running his hands along Belle's neck. Oh, that training is still up there in your head? The next morning, Jake decided to try working cattle with Belle using some of her movie training. He set up a simple obstacle course in one of his corrals using barrels and poles, then brought in a few gentle cows that needed to be moved to a different pasture. Belle seemed to understand immediately what Jake wanted. She worked the cattle with a precision and style that went far beyond normal ranch work. She could position herself at exact angles, respond to the slightest pressure from Jake's legs, and anticipate the cattle's movements like she was reading their minds. But what really amazed Jake was how much Belle seemed to enjoy the work. Her ears were pricked forward, her steps were light and energetic, and she had an alertness that reminded him of the young horse in the movie clips. You missed this, didn't you? Jake said as they finished moving the last cow. You missed having a job to do. Over the following weeks, Jake began incorporating more of Belle's movie training into their daily routine. Not because he needed her to perform stunts, but because he could see how much she enjoyed using her skills again. It was like watching an artist return to painting or a musician pick up an instrument after years away. Word about Belle's abilities began to spread around the local ranching community. Jake's neighbor Tom stopped by one afternoon and watched in amazement as Belle performed some of her movie tricks. Jake, I've been around horses my whole life and I've never seen anything like that, Tom said. That horse moves like she's reading your mind. She kind of is, Jake replied, scratching Belle behind the ears. She was trained to pick up on the smallest cues and respond instantly. It's what made her so good at movie work. Jake started getting calls from other ranchers who wanted to see Belle work. Some of them had difficult cattle that needed moving, and they'd heard that Jake's horse could handle problems that stumped other ranch horses. Belle seemed to relish these challenges, whether it was a stubborn bull that refused to move or a group of skittish heifers that scattered every time someone approached. Belle had a solution. She could work quietly when the cattle were nervous, or with dramatic flair when they needed strong encouragement. But the most rewarding part for Jake was seeing how happy Belle had become. The quiet, resigned horse he'd bought at the auction had been replaced by a confident, energetic animal who looked forward to each new day. She had purpose again, and it showed in everything she did. 6 months had passed since Jake first discovered Belle's Hollywood past, and their lives had settled into a comfortable rhythm. Belle had regained not just her health but her confidence. working alongside Jake on the ranch with skills that amazed everyone who saw her. But Jake never expected that. Belle's story would catch the attention of people beyond their small ranching community. It started with a phone call on a Tuesday morning. Jake was feeding Belle when his cell phone rang. The caller introduced himself as David Chun, a professor at the University of Texas Film School in Austin. "Mr. Martinez, I hope you don't mind me calling out of the blue," David said. "I got your number from Betty Williams, who mentioned that you own a horse with a rather unusual background." Jake was immediately wary. Betty had promised not to share Belle's story without asking first, but apparently word had traveled farther than either of them had intended. "What kind of background are you referring to?" Jake asked carefully. "A horse that worked in Hollywood. Films. Betty mentioned that you have documentation and video footage of her career." "I'm working on a documentary about the history of animal actors in Western movies, and I'd love to talk with you about possibly including your horse's story." Jake looked at Belle, who was watching him with those intelligent eyes. He'd grown protective of her privacy over the past months, turning down several requests from local newspapers who wanted to write stories about the movie star horse. But something about David's voice sounded genuine and respectful. "What exactly are you looking for?" Jake asked. "Just an interview, really. Maybe some footage of her now to show how well she's doing in retirement." The documentary is about celebrating these animals and the incredible work they did. It's not sensational or exploitative, it's more like a tribute. Jake agreed to meet with David the following week, partly out of curiosity and partly because he thought Belle's story deserved to be told properly. When David arrived at the ranch with a small camera crew, Jake was relieved to see that they were respectful and professional. David was a quiet man in his 40s, who clearly loved both horses and movies. He spent an hour just talking with Jake about Belle's story before they started filming anything. He was fascinated by the journey from auction house to Hollywood discovery, and he asked thoughtful questions about Belle's current life. "The theme of our documentary is about the bond between humans and animals in filmmaking," David explained. "Your story with Belle is perfect because it shows how these relationships can continue long after the cameras stop rolling. When they started filming, Jake was nervous about being on camera, but David made the process comfortable and natural. They filmed Jake and Belle doing regular ranch work, moving cattle, checking fences, and just spending time together. Belle seemed to enjoy the attention. Her ears perked forward with interest at all the new people and equipment. The most magical moment came when David asked Jake to demonstrate some of Belle's movie training. Jake had been hesitant to turn their session into a performance, but Belle seemed eager to show off her skills. With the cameras rolling, Jake gave Belle the hand signal to rear up. She responded immediately, rising up on her hind legs with perfect balance and grace. The film crew watched in amazed silence as Belle performed several of her old routines, moving through the sequences with the precision of a professional. "Cut!" David called out, his voice filled with excitement. "That was incredible. You can see the joy in her eyes when she's performing. She's not just going through the motions, she's actually enjoying herself." The filming wrapped up after half a day, and David promised to send Jake a copy of the finished documentary when it was complete. Jake thought that would be the end of Belle's return to show business, but he was wrong. 3 months later, David called again with unexpected news. The documentary, titled Hoofbeats in Hollywood, had been accepted into several film festivals and was getting positive reviews from critics. More importantly, Belle's segment had become one of the most talked about parts of the film. "People are calling it a feel-good story about second chances," David told Jake. "Belle represents hope for older animals and the importance of recognizing value that isn't immediately obvious." The documentary won awards at 3 different film festivals, including Best Documentary Short at the Austin Film Festival. Jake and Belle were invited to attend the Austin screening, though Jake politely declined. He wasn't comfortable with that level of attention, and he worried about how Belle would handle crowds and noise, but the success of the documentary brought other opportunities. A local television station wanted to do a feature story. A magazine that focused on horse rescue operations asked for an interview. Most surprisingly, a writing therapy center in San Antonio reached out after seeing the documentary. The therapy center was run by a woman named Patricia who worked with children and adults who had various physical and emotional challenges. She'd been looking for a special horse to add to her program, and Belle's story had caught her attention. "We don't need her to perform movie stunts," Patricia explained during a phone call with Jake. "But her intelligence and gentle nature, combined with her training, could make her perfect for our work. She already knows how to read human body language and respond to subtle cues. Those are exactly the skills we need for therapy work." Jake was intrigued but cautious. Belle was now in her 30s, and he didn't want to put her through stress or work that might be too demanding. But when Patricia visited the ranch to meet Belle, Jake could see immediately that this might be a perfect match. Patricia approached Belle with the calm confidence of someone who understood horses deeply. She spent an hour just observing Belle's behavior, watching how she interacted with Jake and responded to different situations. "She has exactly the temperament we're looking for," Patricia said. "Calm but alert, responsive but not excitable. And her movie training means she's used to working with all kinds of people in different situations." They arranged for Belle to visit the therapy center for a trial session. Jake was nervous about taking her somewhere new, but Belle loaded into the trailer with the same calm acceptance she'd shown that first day at the auction. The therapy center was unlike anything Jake had expected. It was a peaceful place with wide, clean arenas and specially designed equipment for riders with different abilities. The staff moved quietly and spoke in gentle voices, creating an atmosphere of safety and trust. Belle's first session was with a 10-year-old boy named Carlos who had been struggling with anxiety since his parents' divorce. He was afraid of horses and had been working with the center's other therapy animals for months. With limited progress, Jake watched from outside the arena as Patricia led Belle over to where Carlos sat on a bench with his therapist. Belle seemed to sense immediately that this was different from their usual work. She moved more slowly, keeping her head low and her movements gentle. When Carlos reached out tentatively to touch Belle's nose, she stood perfectly still, barely breathing. As the boy's confidence grew and he began stroking her neck, Belle actually took a small step closer, offering him more contact. "She knows," Patricia said quietly to Jake. "She understands that he needs something different from her." By the end of the session, Carlos was leading Belle around the arena with a confidence that amazed his therapist. Belle followed his small steps patiently, never pulling or rushing, adjusting her pace perfectly to match his needs. "I've never seen her connect with someone so quickly," the therapist told Jake. "Usually it takes weeks to build that kind of trust." Over the following months, Belle began spending 2 days a week at the therapy center. She worked with children who had autism, adults recovering from injuries, and elderly people dealing with depression and isolation. Each client was different, but Belle seemed to instinctively know what each person needed from her. Jake would drop her off in the morning and pick her up in the afternoon, and he could see how much she enjoyed this new work. She had the same alertness and energy that she'd shown when rediscovering her movie training, but this was deeper somehow. She was using her skills to help people heal, and it gave her a sense of purpose that went beyond entertainment or even ranch work. "She's found her true calling," Patricia told Jake one afternoon as they watched Belle work with a shy teenage girl who rarely spoke. "Some horses are born to run, some are born to jump, but Belle was born to connect with people. Everything else was just preparing her for this." 5 years had passed since Belle began her work at the therapy center, and at 32 years old, she had become something of a legend in the equine therapy community. Jake often marveled at how a horse he'd bought out of pity had touched so many lives and brought joy to people he never would have met otherwise. Belle's schedule had evolved over the years. She still spent 3 days a week at the therapy center, but her workload was lighter now, tailored to her advancing age and the wisdom that came with it. Patricia had learned to read Belle's moods and energy levels, never pushing her beyond what she was comfortable giving. On this particular morning in early spring, Jake was preparing Belle for what would turn out to be one of her most important sessions. A new client was coming to the center, a military veteran named Michael who had been struggling with post-traumatic stress since returning from overseas. He'd tried traditional therapy, support groups, and medication, but nothing had helped him reconnect with the world around him. Jake loaded Belle into the trailer with the same care he'd shown for the past 7 years. She moved more slowly now, her arthritis more noticeable on cold mornings, but her eyes still held that same intelligent spark that had first caught his attention at the auction. "Big day today, girl," Jake said, scratching behind her ears as they drove toward San Antonio. "Patricia says this young man really needs you." At the therapy center, Patricia briefed Jake about Michael's situation. The young veteran had been through multiple deployments and had seen things that haunted his sleep and made it difficult for him to trust anyone. He'd agreed to try equine therapy only because his sister had begged him to give it one more chance. When Michael arrived, Jake could see the tension in every line of his body. He was a tall, lean man in his late 20s, but he carried himself like someone much older. His eyes darted constantly around the facility, and he kept his back to walls whenever possible. Belle was grazing peacefully in the arena when Patricia led Michael through the gate. Jake watched from the observation area. As the young man stopped several feet away from Belle, his hands clenched at his sides. "She's old," Michael said, his voice rough with disuse. 32 years old, Patricia replied calmly. "She's seen a lot in her life, just like you have." Belle lifted her head and looked at Michael without moving toward him. Jake had watched her do this hundreds of times, that initial assessment where she seemed to take the measure of a person's emotional state and adjust her approach accordingly, for several minutes. Michael and Belle just looked at each other across the arena. Jake could see the internal struggle playing out on the young man's face, the desire to connect warring with the fear of being vulnerable. Finally, Belle took a single step forward, then another. She moved with deliberate slowness, telegraphing every movement so Michael would never feel surprised or threatened. When she was close enough to touch, she stopped and lowered her head slightly, offering herself without demanding anything in return. Michael's hand trembled as he reached out to touch Belle's neck. The moment his palm made contact with her warm coat, something shifted in his posture. His shoulders dropped slightly, and Jake could see him take his first deep breath since arriving. "She understands," Michael whispered, more to himself than to Patricia. Over the following weeks, Michael began visiting the center regularly. His sessions with Belle weren't like the others Jake had observed. There were no specific exercises or goals, just two beings who had seen difficult things learning to trust each other. Belle seemed to sense that Michael needed space and time more than anything else. She would stand quietly while he brushed her coat, never moving unless he indicated it was okay. Sometimes they would walk slowly around the arena together, Belle matching her pace exactly to his. The breakthrough came during Michael's 6th session. Jake was watching from his usual spot when he saw something that made his eyes fill with tears. Michael was standing next to Belle, his forehead pressed against her neck, and he was crying deep, silent sobs that seemed to come from somewhere he'd kept locked away for years. Belle stood absolutely still, providing a steady, warm presence while Michael finally let out the pain he'd been carrying. Patricia later told Jake that it was the first time Michael had cried since coming home from deployment. "Belle saved his life," Patricia said simply. "Sometimes that's what healing looks like, one quiet moment at a time." As Belle's reputation in the therapy community grew, Jake began receiving visitors from all over Texas and beyond. Other therapy centers wanted to learn about her techniques. Researchers studying animal-assisted therapy asked to observe her sessions. A few times, news reporters came to do stories about the remarkable horse who was helping people heal, but Jake's favorite visitors were the former clients who came back to see Belle years after their sessions had ended. Carlos, the anxious boy, from Belle's early days, returned as a confident teenager to introduce Belle to his girlfriend. An elderly woman named Dorothy, who had worked with Belle during her recovery from a stroke, brought her grandchildren to meet the horse who had helped her walk again. Each visit reminded Jake of the incredible journey he and Belle had taken together. From that first day at the auction to watching her help people rebuild their lives, Belle had exceeded every expectation he could have imagined. As Belle entered her 33rd year, Jake began to notice subtle changes that told him their time together was entering a new phase. She tired more easily during therapy sessions. Her appetite was still good, but she moved with the careful deliberation of an elderly horse managing aches and pains. Jake adjusted Belle's schedule again, reducing her therapy work to just 1 day a week. The rest of the time she spent in peaceful retirement on the ranch, grazing in the pastures where she'd first learned to trust again. On a warm evening in late summer, Jake received a call from Robert Clearwater in Arizona. The old trainer was now 91 years old, but his voice was still strong when he asked about Belle. "How's our girl doing, Jake?" "She's slowing down, but she's content," Jake replied honestly. "She's had a good life here." "I've been thinking about her a lot lately," Robert said. "When I trained her all those years ago, I never imagined she'd go on to help people the way she has. Her movie career was impressive, but what she's done since then, that's her real legacy." A few weeks later, a package arrived from Arizona. Inside was Belle's original movie contract from 1991, along with a collection of photographs Robert had kept all these years. There was also a letter written in the old trainer's shaky handwriting. "Jake, Belle belongs to you now in every way that matters, but I wanted you to have these pieces of her history. She was always special, but you helped her become something even greater than I ever trained her to be. Thank you for giving her the chance to show the world what horses can really do when they're loved and understood." That evening Jake sat in Belle's pasture with the photographs spread around him. Belle grazed nearby, occasionally wandering over to investigate the papers with mild curiosity. The photos showed her journey from young movie star to beloved therapy horse, but they couldn't capture the most important part of her story, the quiet moments of connection, the healing she'd provided, the lives she'd touched with her gentle wisdom. As the sun set over the Texas prairie, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Jake reflected on the incredible good fortune that had brought Belle into his life. He'd gone to an auction looking for a workhorse and had found something much more valuable: a teacher, a healer, and a friend who had shown him that sometimes the most extraordinary gifts come disguised as ordinary acts of kindness. Belle wandered over and rested her head on Jake's shoulder, a gesture she'd been making for years but which never failed to move him. In that moment, watching the stars appear in the darkening sky, Jake understood that Belle's true legacy wasn't the movies she'd appeared in, or even the people she'd helped heal. Her real gift was showing everyone who knew her that every living being had value, purpose, and the capacity to make the world a little bit better. At 33 years old, Belle was still teaching that lesson every day, simply by being who she was, a horse who had never forgotten how to hope, how to trust, and how to love.